Okay, who can tell me why the Wellington Phoenix football team is called the Phoenix? Anybody? Anybody know the reason for that? Not one. Eric, you know?
Because the Kings got disbanded and the Phoenix rose up.
Well, that's pretty much it. Yes. So let me go back a bit. The phoenix was a mythological bird in a story that was part of the culture of Egypt and Arabia in their legend. And when it came time for this mythological bird to die, apparently it would build itself a nest out of incense and myrrh, and then it would enter into the nest and it would die. But eventually the nest would catch fire, so the story went. And the dead bird would be burnt up, so there was just a pile of ash left. But according to the myth, out of these ashes would come a new bird, alive and beautiful and glorious. And so today, people still talk about a phoenix rising from the ashes. You might still hear that phrase. What on earth has that kind of resurrection story got to do with a football team? Well, as Eric mentioned, there was a team in Auckland called the Kings, you said. A number of years ago, when New Zealand decided they'd love to have a football team, a professional football team playing in the A-League, the Australian Football League, an Auckland consortium got the license. They named the team the Kings, and the Kings entered into the A-League. Sadly, they didn't do very well, and it wasn't very long before they collapsed. The consortium went bung, and the license was just kind of hanging there. Was there anybody else in New Zealand who might like to have a football team, a professional football team? Well, another group of Auckland people got together, and they established another team, and they called it the Knights. And the Knights played in the A-League for not very long. And they also collapsed and failed. And so then a group of sports enthusiasts and businessmen in Wellington got together and said, well, maybe we could get together this team and use this license before it goes defunct. And so they put together a team, and they ran a competition in Wellington to name the team. What would be a good name for this new professional soccer team? And the most popular name by far was the Phoenix. Something rising from the ashes, a resurrection, a new hope, a story of life where there had been failure and death before. And the Phoenix has lasted and survived and even flourished. And at the moment, I'm sure you'll be excited to know, they're within the top six of the finals, and they've got a few more games to play. They're playing this afternoon, their first game back in New Zealand, because they've had to relocate to Australia because of all of the COVID and stuff. First game back in New Zealand for nearly 3 years this afternoon. And next weekend they're playing in Auckland. And if they keep winning in the next few weeks, they'll make the finals. So, that's very exciting news. That's a bit of a resurrection story for you. Interestingly, in the early church, that legend of the phoenix bird came to be used as a symbol of the resurrection of Jesus. One of the early church fathers who lived in the 2nd century, a theologian and writer called Clement of Alexandria, he wrote of the phoenix story as a wonderful sign of the resurrection of Jesus. Christians have always looked for words and signs and symbols, pictures, stories to try and help explain and comprehend the resurrection. Things that will help us get some kind of handle on it. Things that will help us think, oh yeah, that's what it's like. Because in reality, the resurrection story is beyond our explanation. And it's beyond our comprehension. So any kind of picture or image we can pick up and say, oh, it's like that. That helps us to get our heads around it. A contemporary theologian and New Testament scholar Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, in his wonderful book Surprised by Hope, writes, have we got here it comes, says Aaron. This is going to be a resurrection. We hope. Well, he wrote, Jesus' resurrection is the beginning of new life. And that's important to get our heads around. The New Testament talks quite a bit about the resurrection of Jesus being like the first fruits. And that's an image of harvest. You know, when the first berries appear on the tree, or it's the first fruits, it's the first sign that a harvest is coming. And that's how the New Testament talks about the resurrection of Jesus. It's the beginning of something great that is coming. The beginning of resurrection that is more than just about one man. And Enright says, and just picture this. You can see this picture in your mind. It's the fresh grass growing through the concrete of corruption and decay in the old world. Now, we know there's a lot of corruption, a lot of decay, a lot of death, a lot of failure in the old world. But Wright says the resurrection of Jesus is like the fresh grass growing through that concrete, those broken slabs of concrete, the sign that there's new life, something greater is coming. And then he says, so that's the beginning of new life. He says, final redemption will be the moment when heaven and earth are joined together at last in a burst of God's creative energy, for which Easter is the prototype and the source. So the prototype means it shows us what it's going to be like. We look at the resurrection of Jesus, we look at the raised Jesus, and we have an idea of what it's going to be like at the end when the great resurrection happens. And it's also the source of it. It's through Jesus' conquering of death, conquering of decay and suffering. It's through that the final harvest of resurrection will occur. And according to the Bible, not only will we human beings follow Jesus by being resurrected as he was, but Paul tells us, the Apostle Paul tells us in Romans, it's not only about human beings. All of creation, we just sang that a few moments ago. All of creation is waiting to be liberated, redeemed, made new, resurrected. And in Revelation, right at the end of the Bible story, it talks about a new heaven and a new earth. Everything is made new. A new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. And the one seated on the throne saying, I am making everything new. It's not just about us. That's what this Easter event is all about. Renewal, transformation, redemption, resurrection for all things. Everything. Because of and through the resurrection of Jesus. And it seems from what the scripture tells us that this resurrection and glorious transformation of human beings, when it happens, of which Jesus is the first fruits, following in his footsteps, that will be, in fact, the catalyst for the redemption of all of God's good creation. It's waiting. All of creation is waiting in eager expectation for this transformation, for this resurrection that will happen when we are raised to be with Jesus. Listen to what Paul writes in his letter to the Romans. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. That's what creation's waiting for. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of us, the children of God. And it makes sense. Because if you think about why creation is in this state of frustration where there's death and decay, it's because of human sin. The first human sin brought about the fall of all of creation. The creation is in bondage to death and decay because the first human beings broke away from God's plan and purpose. And therefore, redemption, transformation, resurrection of all of creation will almost, it seems, be a flow-on effect of the full and final redemption and resurrection of human beings. And just as Jesus' resurrection was bodily, and we heard that in the story about Jesus saying, I've got flesh and bones, eating broiled fish. It's a bodily resurrection. So will we be raised bodily. And to dwell in and enjoy and care for this redeemed physical creation, a real tangible world. That's what's ahead for us. Our future hope is tangible, it's real, it's physical, it's solid, it's material, just as Jesus' resurrection body was. He's the first fruits. He's the prototype of what is coming. More from that chapter, Romans 8. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. And earlier in that chapter, Paul writes, and if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who lives in you. So, that's what's ahead for us. What does Jesus' bodily resurrection actually mean for us? What difference does it make? What does Jesus' bodily resurrection mean for us? There's a couple of points that I want to make about that because it's important, I think, we understand this. First of all, let's look at some other words written by the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Philippians. Philippians 3:20 to 21. He says, but our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await a Savior from there, the Lord Jesus Christ, who by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body. Citizenship in heaven. What does that mean? Citizenship in heaven. There's two possible ways of interpreting that idea. First is that we will eventually go and live in that place where we are citizens. We're going to go to heaven because that's where our citizenship is. That's where we will end up. We'll dwell in heaven, which is our real home, rather than here on earth where we don't really belong. The other way of understanding that phrase is that we are agents of the kingdom whose citizenship we enjoy. So we're citizens of heaven planted here to do the work of the kingdom of heaven. In Roman times, when Paul was writing, colonies of Roman citizens would be established in various parts around the empire, and their purpose was to help assert Caesar's authority in all of these different corners where his reign was hoped to be adhered to. So the Roman Empire would plant groups, colonies of Roman citizens in all of these different places. And that's what Philippi was. This is the city that Paul is writing this letter to. They understood this language. They were citizens of Rome planted in Philippi to do the will of the emperor, to keep the empire growing and thriving. The Apostle Paul often in the New Testament speaks of his own Roman citizenship. But there's never any sense that he's saying, I'm planning to retire in Rome. There's no sense that Rome is his ultimate home. He's not waiting till the day when he's finished being a missionary and a New Testament writer. He just take it easy, go back to Rome, which is his home. That's not what Paul is talking about. His Roman citizenship is for him a privilege, and he talks about that it's something he has that others don't, and it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to do the work God's called him to. And being citizens of heaven is about us having the privilege and the opportunity and the responsibility of being agents of God's kingdom here on earth until Jesus returns. We are citizens of heaven planted here to do the work of the kingdom until Jesus returns. At which point, what does Paul say will happen? He will transform these lowly bodies to be like his glorious body. And like his glorious body, these gloriously transformed bodies will be physical bodies for living in a gloriously transformed physical world. So that's the first thing to think about. What might it mean to be a citizen of heaven but living here and waiting for the final resurrection? Second thing I want to highlight is from another of Paul's letters in Colossians, and in chapter 3 he writes, since then you have been raised with Christ. So there's a sense in which that resurrection's already happened. It's another sense in which we're waiting for its fulfillment. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died. He's talking about the picture of baptism. You died, you're dead and buried, your old life. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Set your mind on heavenly things. Again, there's two ways that we can understand that phrase, setting our hearts on things above. One way of understanding that is that Paul is saying, set your mind on heavenly stuff. Don't worry too much about the things of this world. Like there's an old song that some of you will remember singing, I think. This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. What happens here doesn't matter. It's up there that matters. That's the real life. Well, is that what Paul's talking about? The other way of understanding it is be focused on heavenly things, on heavenly values, on God's kingdom, his will and his purposes, so that you live here in such a way that advances his cause here and now, such a way that establishes his kingdom here and now. And that second interpretation fits much better with the context here in Colossians 3. Paul says, you died. That old person you used to be, that person is gone. That person no longer exists. And he lists a whole lot of characteristics of that former way of life. And he says, put those things to death also, because that person is dead and buried. And to that list in verse 5 that we read, he adds a whole lot more as the chapter continues. Anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language, lying. And eventually he talks about disunity, separating yourselves into groups. All of that belongs to your old way of life, because you've taken off your old self. You've put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Isn't that interesting that Paul says, you've put on the new self, which is being renewed? Which does he mean? Have we put on this new self, or is it being renewed? What's going on? And that's that thing we struggle with, that it's happened and yet it hasn't happened. The already but the not yet. You've put on the new self, which God has done, Christ has done. We've been made new, and yet we all know there's a whole lot more renewing still to take place. And the Spirit is continually working in us to make us the new people we already are. Put on the new self. You've put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge, in the image of its creator. Being renewed in the image of its creator. It's that partnership thing I talked about a few weeks ago, that God does it all, and yet he invites us to partner with him to make it all happen and be real. You've put on the new self, which is being renewed as we partner with God and allow him to transform us. And Paul says your new life is currently hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. When Christ, who is your life, appears. Notice he doesn't say you will go to be with him then in glory. You'll go up to heaven at that point. No, he says when he appears here, the life you already have in him will also appear. It will be fully visible and it will be fully experienced in glory. That will happen here. When he appears here, when his new glorious resurrection life of all of creation also appears, comes down out of heaven, all things being made new in glory. And just in case you think, well, maybe that's what Paul thought, but I don't think anybody else at the time thought like that, here's what the Apostle John says. Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. But we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. So that same kind of idea, that when Christ appears, when the risen Jesus returns, we will be transformed. These bodies, our lowly bodies, will be transformed into glorious bodies like his. He's the first fruits. What about what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5? For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling. Because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. For while we are in this tent, we groan and are burdened because we do not wish to be unclothed, but to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now, the one who has fashioned us for this very purpose is God, who's given us the Spirit as a deposit, guaranteeing what is to come. Isn't that a very clear statement that our final home, our ultimate destination is heaven? Our eternal dwelling, the glorious body we will finally wear, is waiting for us there. From our vantage point, when we try to look at all the stuff, when we try to understand all the stuff that's kind of out there in the future, we're peering into a fog. There's a lot of mystery. Again, to quote Paul, we are looking into a glass darkly. We can see bits and pieces, but we can't see the full picture. But as we grapple with the different things the New Testament says on this subject, it clearly indicates that resurrection, bodily resurrection and transformation to be like Jesus, that's what will happen at the end when he returns. Bodily resurrection to be like Jesus, physical beings as he is. What happens to the dead in the meantime, until the time of that final resurrection, that's a whole different topic. There's lots of theological books written about that, and we don't have time to go into all of that this morning. You know, for example, the obvious question is, what did Jesus mean when he said to the thief on the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise"? How do we understand that? The short answer, I think, is that it's placing the eternal beside the temporal, and the two don't mix. And you know, I'm happy to talk some more with you about that. But it's important to understand that when the New Testament writers speak of resurrection, what they have in mind is the great rising of the dead. So what Paul is doing here in 2 Corinthians 5, he's giving some insight into that resurrection as he too peers into the fog of the future. And he says, these current bodies we have, they decay and die. And we know that, don't we? You don't have to look very far. Our current bodies decay and die. And indeed, everything about our current existence is like this. Whole civilizations crumble and die into dust. But, says Paul, and this is the important thing, having a bodily existence does not have to be like this. It's not automatic that because you've got a physical body, it's going to decay and die. That's what always must happen. To be physical is not necessarily to be impermanent, transitory, changeable, weak, mortal, and that word means subject to death. Doesn't automatically follow that if we have a physical body, we're going to be mortal, subject to death. No, God has for us, says Paul, a heavenly dwelling, a heavenly body, physical, in which we will be clothed, so that what is mortal, subject to death, will be swallowed up by what? By life. What is mortal will be swallowed up by life. He's given us the Spirit as the deposit, guaranteeing that all of this is going to happen. It is going to come. And Paul uses in this discussion, he uses words like tent and building, house, dwelling, built, clothed, words with a strong, physical, tangible, solid feel. But he does talk about an eternal house in heaven, a heavenly dwelling. Surely that's pretty clear. Ultimately, we're going to live in heaven rather than on this renewed earth. Well, I think it's at least feasible to think of that in a different way, which fits with all of these other things in the New Testament we've been looking at this morning. Heaven is the place where God's purposes and blessings for the future are stored up. Doesn't mean that's where they have to stay, nor that that's where we have to go to receive and enjoy them. Heaven is where they're being kept safe for us until it's time for us to receive them. For example, if I say to a friend, I've got a Coke for you in the fridge, it doesn't mean that friend's got to climb into the fridge in order to drink it. That's just where it's being kept. Back to that quotation from Tom Wright. Final redemption. So the resurrection of Jesus is the beginning. Final redemption will be the moment when heaven and earth are joined together at last, in a burst of God's creative energy for which Easter is the prototype and source. The resurrection of Jesus is a burst of God's creative energy. Easter's the prototype and the source of what is to come. Heaven and earth joined together at last. The blessings and purposes of God currently stored up for us in heaven, able to be freely enjoyed by his people on a restored and renewed earth, the mortal swallowed up by life. As Jesus, the one whose life swallowed up that mortality, our mortality, that he chose to share with us, as Jesus returns and appears in glory. That is the dominant New Testament picture of what's going to happen at the end of this age. That's what Jesus' bodily resurrection means for us. When I think of the resurrection of Jesus, what it means for us, when I think of our lowly bodies being transformed into like his glorious body, when I think of the mortal being swallowed up by life, because Jesus is alive, I think of a story about an 8-year-old boy called Philip. Now, Philip was born with Down syndrome, and you could, I guess, see that as one of the signs of the decay of our world, that God didn't create Down syndrome. It's part of the fallenness of our world. Philip's parents were Christians. They were part of a church community. So Philip went to Sunday school every Sunday. And one Easter Sunday, the Sunday school teacher, I don't know how many of you, I don't know if they still have these things. Some of you will be old enough to remember them. Those legs, pantyhose containers that in the shape of eggs, Anybody remember? Yes, a few of them nodding. That's good. So they're plastic eggs, basically, that you could open. And the Sunday school teacher took along a whole lot of these plastic egg-shaped containers. She gave one to each child in the class and told them to go outside and find some symbol for new life that they could put inside this plastic egg. And back in the classroom, they'd share their symbols of new life, opening the containers one by one to see what each person had found. Well, after running about the church property in typical 8-year-old enthusiastic confusion, the children eventually returned to the classroom and placed their containers on the table. And surrounded by the eager children, the teacher, one by one, opened the containers. There was a flower, there was a butterfly, there was a leaf, all the kinds of things that you would expect kids to have put in these containers. And as each one was revealed, the whole class would ooh and ah. And then the teacher opened one of the eggs. There was nothing inside. And the children exclaimed, "Somebody didn't do it right. That's stupid." And Philip spoke up. "That's mine." "Oh, Philip, you don't ever do things right," said one of the other children. "There's nothing in there." "I did so do it right," Philip insisted. "It's empty." The tomb was empty. And there was silence. And from that moment on, Philip became a fully accepted member of that Sunday school class in a way he never had been before. It wasn't long, though, after that Easter that Philip died from an infection most children would have shrugged off relatively easily. At his funeral, his class of 8-year-old friends, together with their teacher, marched up to the front of the church and placed on Philip's coffin not flowers, but empty plastic pantyhose eggs. It's empty. The tomb is empty. That's the beginning, the first fruits of the life that is to come for all of us. Christ is risen. Christ is risen. Christ is risen.